Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us for FBI-LEEDA's April webinar series. Today, we have Director of Curriculum and Instruction, Dr. Neil Moore, who will be joined by presenter Chief Todd LeDuc of LifeScan Wellness. Today's webinar will be recorded and be available to all attendees on our social media platform as well as FBI-LEEDA.org. We will also be sending a certificate to all participants today, and for more information, please go ahead and visit FBI-LEEDA.org. Okay, we're going to get started. Go ahead and cue it off, Dr. Neil Moore.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Neil Moore. I'm the Director of Curriculum and Instruction with the FBI's Law Enforcement Executive Development Association. And part of our mission is to advance the science and art of law enforcement leadership. Today's topic, again, very timely, and we have a very, very special guest. I'm very excited for the show today. It's going to be about health issues facing first responders during the coronavirus pandemic. But also, we're going to do a little more than that. Our subject matter expert today is Chief Todd LeDuc. Todd retired from the Broward County, Florida Fire Rescue Service after 29 years of service through the ranks. He served as both Deputy Chief and Assistant Fire Chief for the Broward County Fire Rescue Service. He has a master's degree in Executive Fire Service Leadership. He is designated as a Chief Fire Officer and holds fellow status in the Institute of Fire Engineers. For over a decade, Chief LeDuc served as a board member of the International Association of Fire Chiefs on their Safety, Health, and Survival section, and he's currently the section secretary there. He currently serves as a peer reviewer for agency accreditation and professional designation and facilitates the issuance of grants through FEMA Assistance to Firefighters. During his tenure, Chief LeDuc was instrumental in the initiation and production of the IAFC's Healthcare Providers Guide for Firefighter Physicals, and is an advisory board member to the Fire Rescue Center of Excellence on Firefighter Physicals. It's also noteworthy for today especially that Chief LeDuc is one of the leading contributors to an upcoming book, Surviving the Fire Service, co-authored with other recognizable authorities on firefighter health and safety. In addition to be widely published, he's sought after international presenter on fire service leadership and survival. After he retired, he changed hats and went over to become the Chief Strategy Officer for LifeScan Wellness Center. And he's going to give us navigate us a little bit through LifeScan. If you've not heard of LifeScan, I would advise you to pay special attention when Chief LeDuc starts that discussion. This is one of the premier prevention arms that law enforcement and firefighting service members can engage in. It can have very, very wellness oriented. And I know we've got a full hour packed in here, Chief. So Chief LeDuc, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dr. Moore. I appreciate that. And I certainly am very excited to say you touched on my background, and this is a special treat for myself. While I've spent my entire career engaging in the health, wellness, and survival of firefighters in the nation's fire service. I also had the opportunity in Broward County, Florida. The fire department is actually under the Broward County Sheriff's Office. So I spent a good portion of my career working very closely with our Department of Law Enforcement and our law enforcement command staff. So to have the treat today to speak to the FBI leadership is really just that. It's a treat. I do want to say our LifeScan has been a long-term supporter of the FBI Leader Conference, and certainly disappointing that we're not able to be with everyone at this year's conference, but understandable given those circumstances. And we're looking forward to welcoming you all to Florida next year. I understand the conference is going to be held in Fort Lauderdale, so we'll be certainly rolling out the welcome mat. I want to just take a second and talk about LifeScan, as their partnership has allowed me to be here today and present. So LifeScan Wellness Centers started here in Florida 23 years ago in the law enforcement community with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. Then Sheriff John Rutherford saw the vision of providing very comprehensive early detection physicals aimed at preventing risk to his deputies. Sheriff Rutherford has now gone on to be Congressman Rutherford in Washington, but that's actually where our roots are 23 years ago. And since that time, we now have expanded well beyond Florida throughout the country, and we see 40,000 firefighters and law enforcement officers annually with annual early detection exams, very comprehensive. I'll talk about it a little bit more in detail as we go through. As you mentioned, I had 29 and a half years of service. I got 1 day of golf in retirement. And then I went to work as the Chief Strategy Officer for LifeScan, who had done our firefighter physicals for 10 years in Broward County. So I have firefighters that are alive today because of how comprehensive, and we'll talk about that as well. I wanted to look at what our topic is today. Dr. Moore, you touched on it, which was first responder health and wellness during pandemic. But I think as we evolve into the discussion within the next hour, we'll see some of the overlay of some of the challenges with first responder health during these unique times we're in, but also the occupational risk that is with first responders, whether it's in a pandemic or not, but certainly during times of pandemic may actually be compounded. So I'm going to touch on that. And we're going to have hopefully an interactive discussion today. I know it's a little bit challenging with not being face-to-face. We're doing this virtually, but I want to start off with, before we do that, asking, maybe you can indulge us just a little bit for those that are attending virtually. And I'm going to ask Laura, who's really the brains of this operation, has pieced us all together to make us hopefully sound and look good, and bring you timely information. I'm going to ask if she can put up a poll that we wanted to do. I usually start off my presentations by asking folks to stand, and it's very powerful in the room when you see it, but I want to try to do it, see if we can pull this off virtually, and see if it can have that same impact. So Laura, if you might be able to put that poll up. Okay, I see that now. So for those of you that are listening today and watching, I know we're live streaming this over the, I guess, Facebook. If you all know a colleague that you've served with, you've worked with, who has either battled or succumbed, in many cases, tragically, unfortunately, to cancer, if you can go ahead and just, I don't know what the appropriate term is. I think you can just check or raise your hand. I'm not sure how that works. Laura can, I think you see it on your screen. The same question for if you know a member of the service who has either had a cardiac event, can be high blood pressure, can be stroke, can be a chest pain, mild heart attack, or tragically passed from a cardiac event that did not survive. If you could just let us know that. If tragically, we're going to talk today about behavioral health. I think it's even, it's something we're hearing more and more about. It used to be the elephant in the room for first responders. But many people are saying the challenges of this pandemic, whether it's isolating in your house, whether it's the unknown of being a first responder and being exposed, it's going to have an impact potentially long-term even. So if you know a member of the service that struggled with behavioral health disorders, or tragically has committed suicide. If you could let us know that. And then the last broad category is any type of major health disorder. So I'll let you define that from your perspective. So we'll, I see a note up there, Dr. Moore, that you and I can't vote.
I know.
I would raise my hand to all four of those, though, and I'm sure you would too. You've been a chief in the service for a long time. I'm sure you have colleagues that you lost that were impacted by all of those.
Absolutely.
So I hope you can all see that on your screen. When I do this in person, when I've got, I think we had 360 or some registered for today. Literally, I have 360 members of the audience all standing, and some I've had, with a tear in their eye because it was a near colleague that they, evoked the memory of that they had lost. So, but if you look at these, almost 50% or over of you that are attending today in each category have been impacted by one of these, I'm going to say, occupational disease risks, and we'll talk about that shortly. But and I'm not a statistician. I think that was my most challenging and daunting class I've ever taken. But I know when you have numbers like this and you compound them, it's even higher, right? So we're going to talk about some of the health rigors that challenge us as first responders, whether it be law enforcement, fire, or our emergency medical service folks. So I'm gonna move us on here. I would be remiss if I didn't ask us all just to take a moment of respect and reflection on the service that the men and women of first response in this nation have gone through, continue to go through, and battling the front lines of this epidemic, and their service just day to day. I think sometimes we hear on the 24/7 news cycle so much about the pandemic that we forget that our day-to-day protecting the community continues. In law enforcement and fire, we have those same, domestic disturbances, armed batteries, armed robberies on the fire side. We still have structure fires. We still have people, having strokes. So, but I want to thank them. I want to thank our United States military, and I want to thank our health providers. Really, the true heroes are 911 dispatchers. They always kind of get left in the back because we don't see them oftentimes or on the phone with us. But shouts out to all those that are serving on the front lines as we go through today's presentation. So as the topic was noted, we're going to look at kind of the pandemic quickly. Again, I've only have an hour with you, so I want to move us along at a fairly brisk pace. But we started talking about health effects to first responders through pandemics. So this is just a snapshot. This was not nationwide, but internationally, looking at the number of infected folks, meaning that had an exposure and infection with the virus. You can see the spike globally and continuing out for some period of time. You can also see those that were incubating and then cumulative deaths. We know the United States has been hit very hard. Obviously, we have a very large population. We're still trying to figure out through testing and widespread testing what that actual percent looks like. But we know, I think the latest number I saw today was close to 47,000 members of our population have succumbed to the coronavirus. Obviously, with the testing that's out there, we know the number that have been exposed is much larger than that. So this is a pandemic that many of us in our careers, and I know I've been through, as I'm sure Dr. Moore and we all have, H1N1, swine flu, some of the other avian flu pandemics, but the magnitude in this, the amount of spread that we've seen, particularly, it started out with travel spread, and it evolved into community spread. So that really changed the dynamics. This is actually a daily snapshot, and my slant is kind of fire-based, because as you mentioned, I'm on the board of directors for the International Fire Chiefs Association. But every day, the International Fire Chiefs are updating on their website, ifc.org, the impact to first responders. So how many first responders have been exposed? How many have actually been diagnosed through testing with the COVID virus? And you can see that number. This was a snapshot in time. On one day, personnel, 41 members were diagnosed, and we've seen this throughout the country. The higher density areas, we've all read and seen New York City NYPD, New York Fire, the exposure rates that they've been having. So it makes sense. We're out on the front line. This is a hidden enemy where we actually can't see it. So we're having to assume everything we encounter, everything we touch is potentially a contaminant to us. So very, very similar to a hazardous materials situation. So this is an overlay of hospitalization among folks that have been diagnosed with COVID-19. So we know that there's, just by the testing that has been done, that there's a number of folks that actually have been exposed to the virus. With that exposure, they're asymptomatic in many, if not most cases. And that's one of the reasons why we've had now recommendations about covering face and nose is those asymptomatic folks out there can be spreaders. So they can be spreading. But what I want to look at on this chart, and Dr. Moore, I think we talked about this yesterday when we started the dialogue, is look at where we see hospitalizations. There's a couple driving factors here. One is age, right? And we've all heard that the more senior population is at greater risk, and that seems to tend to be the case. But the other compounding factor is what the term of comorbidity. So even if you have age plus additional disease processes, that puts you in even greater risk. But let's assume you're a younger first responder, but you have hypertension. You can just see these on your screen. Hypertension, you're overweight. You have chronic lung disease. What is that? We have lots of folks that have asthma or other pulmonary function diseases. With being overweight or family history of elevated blood sugars, if you have a diabetic history, or you have underlying cardiac disease, all put you at a higher risk. And what we're showing is that's the population that's being the most severely impacted. Why do I bring that up? On a positive note, we know that the majority of folks that are exposed have either no symptoms or very mild symptoms and recover with some type of antigens developed that hopefully give us some level of immunity. But what we also know is that if you fall into one of these categories that you see up on the screen now, that puts you in higher risk as a factor of both hospitalization and survival. And why we're going to talk about why that's so important to first responders is when you look at all these conditions at the bottom, I want to talk about what we see in first responders. That first poll I had everyone take, when it was 50% or over, all knew someone that had been impacted by those. I've turned this to three-legged stool. If you look at the three things that are occupationally causing disability or death in members of public safety, One of them is sudden cardiac death or cardiac disease. We know significant amounts of hypertension exist in first responders based on research. We also know that if you're hypertensive and you don't control it well, or you don't even know you are hypertensive because you're not being screened every year, you're 12 times more likely, the research tells us, to have a fatal cardiac event. We also know that if you're overweight, if you have untreated high blood pressure, you also have what's called a heavy heart. You have an enlarged heart, which places you at higher rate. And then obviously, if you have a family history of cardiac disease or you're smoking, and I think we've knocked a lot of the smoking out. I've only been retired 11 months, so when I left, the big thing was vaping and chewing tobacco. So we know neither one of those are healthy and compromise the immune system. But this last one, look at the last one. And the studies on this are transcend fire. They go into law enforcement and into emergency medical services. Out of all the fatalities that were studied, these are line of duty deaths from cardiac. Look at the age. They were all 45 years or younger. Think about that, 45 years of age or younger, and they've passed away from a sudden cardiac death in the line of duty. 63% of them, right? So these aren't just statistics. This is someone's son, daughter, wife, husband, right? They happen to wear the uniform and serve the community, but they're no longer with us. So I want you to keep that in mind. So we're honoring their memory today by trying to learn from 63% were overweight. And what the national statistics have told us is that first responders are more overweight than general population control in many cases. And you say to yourself, why is that? You're all leaders of public safety. We've all been first responders at some point out on the line. We have high amounts of stress. We're going to talk about not getting good sleep. We're going to talk about eating habits in a little bit. We sometimes struggle to find time for PT or fitness, any type of workout. And when we bundle all that up, we put on the fire side, there's a study out there showing the average firefighter puts on somewhere between 2 and 3 pounds a year if we don't take any intervention. So think about it, after my 30-year career, and I can say this because I was there at one point before I made some changes, that's 90 pounds that you would put on. So we want to just recognize that we've got some of these same comorbid conditions among us, which places at higher risk. This is from the National Cancer Institute. A number of you said at the survey in the beginning that you knew a colleague that had battled or succumbed to cancer. The statistics nationally of general population tell us that about almost 40% of us at some point in our life are going to battle cancer. And typically the older as we age, that number gets higher as we see. But we specifically know NIOSH did a study in firefighters that they have a 9% higher rate of cancer on top of the general population and a 14% higher rate of not surviving the cancer than general population. Firefighters, that largely is from toxic exposure to carcinogens when we go into fire. But the University of Buffalo, you can see this was published in the International Journal of Emergency Mental Health. Buffalo University looked at law enforcement and found they had elevated rates of cancer compared to general population. And you say, well, why is that? And what the findings were, even though it was a smaller study than the NIOSH study, the findings were that the stresses of the job, the sleep cycle interruptions, shift work, nutrition challenges, sometimes poor coping mechanisms. We know in public safety we have typically poor coping mechanisms, higher rates of alcohol use. So we know that we've got higher rates for cardiac, and we know we have higher rates for cancer. You know, and then that third leg of the stool, the question when we surveyed at the very beginning was who knows someone that had committed suicide, and that certainly, you know, we're talking more about first responder suicide than I ever in my 30 years of service before. But suicide is at far end of the spectrum of behavioral health. We know there's a lot of challenges that if they go undetected can lead up to that suicide attempt. Things such as stress, post-traumatic stress disorder, sleep disturbances, alcohol abuse, depression. So when we look at what the numbers are, there's some studies out there that show the rates of, I'll just use post-traumatic stress disorder in first responders. There's one study in particular out there that shows about 37% of responders that were screened had tested positive for post-traumatic stress disorder symptomology. Those are very similar to rates that you would see from combat veterans returning from active duty deployments in combat zones. So we know, you know, I like to say, you know, someone else's worst day in their life is our everyday. That's our normal. We get 911 rings and we're sent out to try to create a new normal out of chaos.
Pardon me, Todd, we actually have a question regarding this.
Sure.
How is COVID-19 impacting the typical levels of PTSD, anxiety, and depression that first responders are going through? And what can leaders of agencies, fire departments be doing in order to address them without normalizing them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Laura, and I think we're learning every day new information about the impacts of COVID-19. I believe there'll be impacts far into the future on responder health that we haven't even thought of yet, similar to post 9/11. For behavioral issues, we know that there's a great amount of uncertainty, not only for the responder, but for the family. And when they're going into a situation where that enemy that they're facing, they can't see. And with that comes a lot of apprehension in terms of protection and protocols and exposure. So we need to have the ability to allow the first responders to decompress some of that anxiety, that fear, that unknown. And that can be done through many different mechanisms, employee assistance programs, which sometimes are fraught with not being well received by first responders, but simply peer support from peer counselors, opening up to licensed mental health providers that work with first responders, simply having open and transparent discussions amongst command staff and the membership, because we're all in this together, and we're there to support the folks on the front line. I know we like to call that the tip of the spear, but these are times of great anxiety. And lastly, I don't want to make sure we don't forget the families as well, right? Our responders are out there, and then the families, they're isolating many times in place, so they've lost their jobs, or they've now, doing homeschooling, and they've got on their mind, is my spouse or loved one or significant other coming home after being exposed. So we're doing the best we can with mitigating and putting risk reduction practices in, both international police chiefs, international fire chiefs. There's a ton of, every day cdc.gov is updating on activities and responses that first responders need to be thinking about and considering and updating. But simply just allowing our members to offload what their concerns are is a great first step. I mean, that's simply, we find even on a day-to-day basis outside of pandemic, just having the ability to talk to a trusted person, and that may not always be a member of command staff. It may be just, it may not even be a member with rank. It may simply be a fellow employee identified as a peer networker or peer counselor. So there's programs in place. If your departments have not been able to get those in place to this point, then intermediary steps in terms of reaching out to support in the community. I know a lot of mental health professionals right now, and a lot of members in the community that have this type of capability are looking, how can we help and give back to the first responder community now? We're making such great sacrifices that we have a lot of mental health professionals out there that not only are resources available through telemedicine and online, but community members are itching at the opportunity to help and give back.
Thank you, Todd. Now, Dr. Neil Moore, do you have any recommendations to those leaders, to those command staff members of the agencies or the fire departments in ways that they can give hope and offer opportunity for individuals come forward without knowing all of the facts?
Well, I think that to try to dovetail onto what Chief LeDuc was saying, I think one of the first things, we've seen some leaders in the police service actually drastically change service schedules. So I know Arizona experienced a couple locations where the chiefs went in and immediately divided their staff and put them on a 14-day cycle, so that there was a time period when you had a large group of your officers that were at home, in essence quarantined, watching, and then another group worked for 14 days, and then they did the switch. And it, again, it's one method that some police chiefs are using to try to keep a healthy workforce in the field on an individual basis. And again, police family, fire family, we have to be concerned about our family members, and that's where a lot of the anxiety comes from when we're in this pandemic. And we've heard some unusual things for family members who are going home at the end of shift or at the end of their work period, finding a neutral place where they can remove all their clothing, having the clothing packaged up in a separate way so that it can be laundered immediately, going immediately to shower and try to make sure that we're using as much strong hygiene as we possibly can. And we know full well that a lot of our people are still going to be exposed, and family members are probably still going to get some exposure to the virus itself. I think the other thing that Chief LeDuc emphasized, and I just reiterate, is we know that when we're in this condition and when the workforce is in this condition, we need to have information, communicate. And so the admonition, the advice to monitor what CDC is saying, what our national leaders are saying with regard to virologists, what's the best information that we're learning about this pandemic almost on a daily basis. We have to convey that into the workforce daily. As we find out, as leaders find out, you have to convey it. You have to be willing to adapt and change protocols to maximize the safety for your officers. And that has to be articulated, I think, verbally, but also making sure they have PPEs with and understanding how they're supposed to be used and changed out to the best of our ability to do so. I mean, all of those send a signal that we're going to do our darndest to keep you safe in lieu of the fact that we're going through this very dangerous pandemic. So those are just a few of the things that I would add, and a lot of it is just reiterating what Chief LeDuc is saying.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah, Laura and Dr. Moore too, we're going to touch in a little bit on self-care is a huge part of this as well. You know, in medicine, the old adage is heal thyself. And one of the things that we'll talk about how to do that, but there's some easy steps in terms of what self-care items that we need to pay attention to on our own health. And that offloads a lot of the behavioral mental health stress as well. So we're going to touch on that briefly. Laura, I'm going to run through these and then have you probably do another poll. But I just want to show you, this is just my department at the Broward Sheriff's Office. All those things that we talked about, the cancer, the cardiac, hypertension, high cholesterol, even behavioral health challenges. These are just numbers. You can see this is from a LifeScan annual 3-hour physical that we do, all focused on just early detection. If we find something early, it's got tremendous good survival for the officer or the firefighter, it has a great outcome. If we find things late, unfortunately, not so much the case. This is actually one of my firefighters that one of the things LifeScan does is an hour of ultrasound as part of the 3-hour exam. So we actually look at carotid arteries, we look at the heart's left ventricle, how it's functioning, we look at the aorta for blockages. This firefighter, we actually found a very aggressive cancer from ultrasound images of a mass that upon further testing turned out to be cancerous. His endocrinologist said it was very aggressive. He likely wouldn't be here with us today. So this was for my retirement. This is probably the best retirement gift I could have received. Was this picture of him and his daughter saying thank you. I mentioned LifeScan sees 40,000 police and firefighters a year. Those same findings are replicated across the country. And the point on this is, this isn't about moving someone off the job. This is about finding things that are oftentimes related to their service, finding it early so we can intervene and treat them successfully. So this kind of touched on the question, in the times we're in, all this additional challenges of stress, anxiety, grief, depression, all swirling around as we try to navigate our job responsibilities, our family responsibilities. But everything we've talked about can be approached through a very methodical approach of early detection. So Dr. Moore touched on the importance of adequate personal protective equipment. I know, there's been a lot of national dialogue on this topic. We know every agency there's guidelines out there. As I mentioned, cdc.gov is probably one of the best ones. But I gotta say, what has been reported, and again, we're learning every day more information is coming out through research. This is an airborne spread disease in most cases, so having that protection, particularly for folks that there's a large number of folks out there, we don't even know how big it is because of the testing's hasn't been done on everyone, but we've got a large group of asymptomatic folks that are out there that can still spread. So rule one is never assume, and if you're going into an encounter where you're going to be within 6 feet of someone, you need to really plan that person could be a carrier. Secondly, the other thing is surface to face contact is how we're seeing that the virus is being introduced. So out of everything we have out there, science is telling us antiseptic, 70% alcohol, or simple hand and soap washing. We've all seen the guidance from the CDC, but that is probably one of the most effective things we can do. And do it repetitively. And I know I find myself consciously not, stopping myself from touching my face in between washing. So I don't want to, do a deep dive on PPE other than to say those couple simple steps are probably the most effective. I also want to touch on some self-care topics that can help us not only get through the pandemic, but also that are long-term strategies for survival of first responders. Laura, can you do put up the second poll, if you will, because we're going to talk about everything we've talked about so far potentially has catastrophic effects if it's not found early. On a positive note, if we find almost all of these, whether it's behavioral health issue, a cancer issue, a cardiac issue, early detection can do wonderful, wonderful things. So the survey is how many of you that are on the webinar get a medical exam from your agency, and if so, the frequency. And if not, that's okay too. There's a box there for that. So we want to just get a sense of we know, as we talked about in the first half of this webinar, the prevalence of some of these occupational risks of cancer, cardiac, and suicide is very significant. But we also want to see how well of a job we're doing at providing those annual physicals to our first responders, our police, our fire, and our medical folks. Just take a second and just answer that if you would, and we'll have the magic of modern technology tabulate. And Dr. Moore and I can't vote again.
That's right.
I will say my agency, we did not have, other than entry level, have an annual occupational physical till about 10 years ago. And that really was probably one of the highlights of my career, is bringing that. I've got more members and firefighters alive today because of doing that. So something very important. But let's see how we're doing as a group here. Survey says.
Wow.
Survey says we're doing. We've got some work to do. It looks like.
Yep.
You know, we've got about 68% of us that are receiving no annual exams from our agencies, and a handful, about a quarter, are receiving, and that's great. Receiving it every year. That's commendable for those of you that are there. So I'm going to keep us moving, but I do want to follow up on that, on the importance.
Wow.
See, Laura, if you can maybe help me advance the. There we go. Thank you. You know, if I had to summarize the importance, you know, and really I'm speaking to that 70 some odd percent that answered that your agencies are not, and this is the same on the fire side. I think in the last decade we've perhaps made some good inroads. I think the last numbers I saw was 80% of paid departments provide some type of exam, and about 60% of volunteer departments, but we still have work to do. But just look at this one slide. This is 4 types of cancers that are very common in police, firefighters, first responders: colon, prostate, breast, and bowel. If we find those through early detection, and that's what LifeScan is built all about, is early detection. We only see first responders, police and fire, but look at the survival rates. If you find a cancer, either precancerous at stage 1, they're almost close to 100% survival in every single type of cancer. When that cancer leaves the primary site of origin and starts traveling throughout your body, that's called the different stages: stage 2, stage 3, stage 4 is it's metastasized throughout the entire body. 5-year survival goes down into single digits for most of them. So the takeaway message here is, we know as police, we know as fire, we're at higher risk than the general population. We need to do a better job. And the message I want to impart with you, with doing early detection exams, and not just during times of pandemic. Hopefully at the beginning of this presentation, the point was made compellingly that those members that have comorbid conditions, particularly if they're not managed well. So if you're hypertensive and you're not managing it well, we haven't even found that out. Yes, you probably are at higher risk during pandemic for susceptibility and hospitalization, and even further complications. So we need to keep our vigilance. I mentioned one portion of this is using ultrasound. That's something LifeScan has done for 23 years. It allows us to, without any radiation, take 3D imaging of your vascular system, of your some of your organs, abdominally, your aorta. We can look at the heart and how it's functioning. We do about a 3-hour assessment. So when we're talking about early detection being the key, that applies to heart disease, cancer, and behavioral health. There's behavioral health screening tools out there that are incorporated into your annual physical exam that can screen for depression, that can screen for post-traumatic stress disorder. No different than cancer. If we find that you have behavioral health struggles or disorder, the earlier we identify that and intervene, the better the outcomes and more successful. So our approach is 3 hours. There's 1 hour with an exercise physiologist that does a physical fitness assessment. There's 1 hour with a ultrasound technician that does ultrasound images of, as I mentioned, the carotids, the thyroid, the aorta, the cardiac function, the abdomen, testicular ultrasound in men and pelvic in women, and then an hour with an advanced registered nurse practitioner that only sees police and fire, that does a head-to-toe exam, goes over lab work, goes over your physical, goes over all the findings. So that's important for not only having a good baseline in terms of your health status, but knowing what risk you have and how to manage that risk. Because in our profession, whether you're a member of command staff or you're the tip of the spear, we know that when we have to go to work, listen, I've served as a firefighter for 30 years and paramedic, but I've done my ride-alongs with law enforcement. And you know, when we either discipline, when we have to go to work, our body goes into what's called a fight or flight scenario, and things start happening. We start releasing chemicals, and our heart rate accelerates, our breathing accelerates, and if we haven't managed that underlying risk, bad things happen, and we know that. So now compound that with, we now have this invisible enemy that we have to be concerned about with that. So we're going to get through the pandemic, not a doubt in my mind, as a nation, and we're going to come out stronger. But I hope this sends the message that there likely will be another pandemic. There will likely be another challenge to us down the road. And our underlying health as first responders is critical on not only our performance, but our survival. So I want you to keep that in mind, please. And as many of you on this webinar, I'm sure, are in senior command leadership positions, it's our responsibility. We all know this, that there's no greater responsibility of leadership than to take care of those we lead. So I want you to keep that in mind. So Laura asked one of the questions, and self-care is a great thing that we need to focus on right now. So that includes, we know that when we get a workout in, and I don't prescribe a workout because I tell the story all the time. I've got firefighters in some of my stations that if I can just get them out of the lazy boy recliner and have them move around a little bit, that's a good step. I've got other members that are CrossFitters, right? So they're at a different juncture. So everyone's different. So that's one of the things we do at LifeScan is we assess where you're at physical fitness wise, and we give you a plan for the next year on how to work there. But do something. Start moving. Start working into your day. Incorporate some healthy behaviors. This is one we did, you know, with some of our firefighters, as we incorporated something simple as yoga, mindfulness. Take 5-10 minutes, close everything down, and focus on meditation, positive thoughts. Sounds corny, but believe it or not, these are things that have been adapted from professional sports, from the United States Military Special Operations Command. It improves mental acuity, physical performance, but also it decompresses some of that anxiety, stress, and that fear and unknown that we're facing, probably more so now than ever with this, again, this hidden enemy. This is work that was done from Harvard University with public safety responders. It basically focused on healthy eating, that if we are able to get away from, you know, traditional high sugars, high carbs, high fats, so that means, you know, sodas loaded with sugar, white breads, processed meat, and focus on much more lean protein, lean fish, lean meat, lean chicken, double up on the vegetables, extra virgin olive oil. the health benefits, not only physically, but lowering blood pressure, lowering cholesterol, improving performance, and actually managing some of those disease risks. We know that officers in public safety that follow this type of nutritional plan have lower risk of cancer, cardiac disease, and behavioral health. So one of the other large issues you see exercise there, but also sleep. And we know that physical and nutrition is important, but we also know that when we can get sleep, and we need to figure out how we can get the best sleep we can, we need to have help. We do that. Cooler environment, dark environment, get rid of the technology and the tools if we can. I know in our business that's hard. Fitting in naps when we can. So we know that sleep is tied to a causation of cancer, cardiac disease, and poor behavioral wellness as well. So it's an important piece. This came out of that same study from Harvard in 5 simple things, just a takeaway. You know, they say, Dr. Moore probably knows this better than I. They say for adult learners that if you attend a conference and you learn 3 to 5 things, that's a home run. If you take 1 or 2 back and implement them, that's the Kentucky Derby. So here's 5 real simple ones. Replace your typical butter and margarine with extra virgin olive oil. Drink a ton of water throughout the day instead of sugar. You know, we know that dehydrated first responders are at higher risk for cardiac events. So, you know, get rid of as much as we can, the large amounts of alcohol. Replace our fats and all that red meat with more leaner proteins. Double, triple up on our vegetables and fruits. And then instead of that, the high carbs and white breads and refined sugars, and start looking at whole grains. Those are some just real simple tips. And obviously, I'm going to add number 6, and that is a annual wellness checkup. You know, I say, and it has to be one that's appropriate to our first responder risks, right? Because if we go to our primary care doctor, they probably don't understand the unique risks of a firefighter or a law enforcement officer. So I want you to add number 6 in for me, and that can be, you know, simple things. We find that your blood pressure is a little bit higher. You got to work on weight, more exercise. So it's those modifiable factors that really seem like they're so simple to do. But in the hectic world that we live in, with the challenges of, you know, we call it on the fire side all hazard provider now, you know, and probably there's no greater time to demonstrate all hazard that, you know, last month or the month before we were worrying about structure fires and heart disease and chest pains, and now we've injected a global pandemic into the equation. So, and I'm sure down the road we're going to have other threats. So the landscape is not likely to change. We will continue to have community threats and risks that first responders are going to be the tip of the spear in mitigating. And if we don't take care of our own health, and as leaders, which is who I'm addressing here, is the leaders of public safety, is we need to assure that I made the comment yesterday, we did a dry run, and, you know, I made the comment we would never think, I would hope, as administrators, of not doing preventative maintenance on our vehicles or our tools of the trade, you know, whether that's a law enforcement vehicle or a fire ladder truck. And we really need to start doing that on our employees as well, because the risks that they face are very unique and specific, and a lot more elevated than most any other profession that's out there. So I want to leave. I know we've gone pretty much the full hour, but I wanted to leave time for some questions if there were any questions. I know Laura's going to send out a bunch of information after this and a link and some additional resources to everyone, but we'll open it up.
We do have one question here. This is from Lieutenant Charles Kermez. He said, hello, I'm a 35 plus year employee of a corrections field. This environment is different from other first responder environments. Do you have any information on how other correction departments in the nation are assisting correctional employees with the mental and medical health issues they're experiencing?
Yes, that's a great question, and I mentioned at the beginning, even though I came up on the fire side as chief officer, and um, we at Broward Sheriff's Office run a very large correctional system, one of the largest in the country. In the challenge with corrections is you're contained to that one facility, right, throughout the entire shift. So it's not like fire where you can go out shopping, or law enforcement that's mobile in most cases. So in Broward, we noticed, just like fire and law, that our detention deputies had significant challenges with health, with obesity, with diabetes, with hypertension. So we actually had to bring to them the tools and resources. We created it was called OWL, Obesity Weight Loss Competition, where we actually basically brought in nutritionists, dietitians, healthy food compared to some of the other choices that were out there. And we actually incentivized the employees that the more they gravitated towards those healthy choices, that we would provide financial and other incentives for them to continue that. So it's a challenging environment. I know that, and it requires a unique approach based on the fixed location and the unique stressors of corrections. That's but I commend you for your service. 35 years is a tremendous amount of time, and I know corrections has all the same challenges of health that the rest of the first responder community does. But I think the answer is we need to bring the solutions into the facilities, and that includes education and advocacy. And I mean, something as simple, we put up signs at every fire station kitchen that had yellow, green, and red. So yellow was go slow with, don't eat much of this. Red was these foods are really bad for you, and green was have all the fruits, vegetables, lean protein. And it was just reinforcing, was teaching, educating. I mean, we send folks to the range to qualify. We do training daily at fire, but we don't, how many of us were taught nutrition and healthy living and self-care at any point in our career? It's likely not. So it's just having that leadership thought and mindset and making those resources available.
Wonderful, thank you. We do have an additional question, and I believe that this might be for Dr. Neil Moore. What are your recommendations as a former chief on having both fire or law enforcement classroom trainings while this pandemic is still so new?
Okay, could you repeat that, Laura?
Sure. What is your recommendation on having both fire and or law enforcement classroom trainings while this pandemic is still so new? I think the question is, how do we prepare the individuals going out and serving while we're still in the situation?
I think we've at FBI-LEEDA, I mean, we've wrestled with this issue. I mean, if you are a member of the FBI-LEEDA family and have been to our trainings, it's not uncommon for us to walk into a classroom that is almost shoulder to shoulder. And the struggle for us is we recognize that, I mean, one of the reasons that we're currently doing webinars is our face-to-face classes have really been shut down as we watch to see what's happening, because if I take a classroom that normally we would put 70 people in, what's it going to look like at 6 feet intervals? You know, it's not necessarily that we are unwilling to do that, but it's a decision where I think the police administrators, the fire administrators have to be comfortable with that setting and understanding the potential risk that even being 6 feet apart may present. So what we're starting to see, and one of the reasons this webinar is really a catalyst for the webinar, is to try to continue with our educational outreach acknowledging that it is safer for everyone viewing this webinar to view it from the comfort of their own home. I think if we go out a couple more weeks and continue to analyze the information from CDC and from the virologists that are trying to advise us on this, I think we're going to be in a better position to assess whether it's going to be safe to resurrect face-to-face in-classroom training. But right now, I would say let's stall it, and if you can get education and training in a format that's virtual classroom, webinar style, that's probably where we should be right now. Todd, do you have anything you want to say on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. The only comment I would make is it's probably what I've seen across the country is it not necessarily a one size fits all. So every department's going to have look at this, look at their infrastructure, look at their community risk, look at their strategies for mitigation, and I think that's, you know, everyone's kind of working through that. So certainly I know I see a number of promotions being done on broadcast on social media, and you know, the chief's doing them, and everyone's 6 feet apart, and some of them have masks, and so people, I think, you know, everyone's working through this, but I think that's spot on, definitely. And if you have these external web-based resources, that's even a, you know, a much obviously an alternative that a lot of people have access to, and it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
We'd love to also take this opportunity to let our attendees know that although our physical brick and mortar FBI-LEEDA classes are currently postponed due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we are still hosting online courses. We have a basic supervisor liability, advanced supervisor liability, and an ethics course, which make up our E-Trilogy courses, and they are offered online. It is self-paced, and they will be starting, I believe, the first week of May, and more information is available on FBI-LEEDA.org.
Good point.
I think that wraps up most of the questions that we have. Todd, if you want to skip to the next slide.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you. Well, we like to take this opportunity to thank all for joining us for this and any other previous webinars that we have. A number of pieces of content, including the recording of this webinar, will be able to be found shortly after at going to FBILEEDA.org. For more information about LifeScan Wellness Centers, please feel free to visit their website. Our next webinar will be the following Thursday, April 30th at 2 p.m. with FBI-LEEDA instructor Judy Powell. She will be speaking with Dr. Neil Moore about crisis communication and media relations during a pandemic. Thank you to everyone again for joining, and of course, thank you to Chief Todd LeDuc for joining us this week.
Thank you. Stay safe out there.
Okay.